You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi, I'm Annie in Massachusetts in the USA.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in for another episode today. One quick announcement that we have for you. If you're a member of our Patreon Murder tier, you already find 2 parts of our Cinema Macabre, where we discuss true crime shows, true crime documentaries, and we started with Candy, the TV show, covering the murder of Betty Gore by Candy Montgomery.
That's right. Yeah, go check that out. That's fun. It's video, which is new for us, and we're working on it. Yeah, it's good. So welcome. If you're confused by the title of today's episode, when we say this is the saddest show, we don't mean our little show here, even though, obviously it's often very sad. When we talk about the history of the so-called freak shows, there's always tension between 2 sides of the story. On one side, you have people like P.T. Barnum, the showman who turned human oddities into a business empire and made himself a household name in the process. On the other side, you have, of course, the performers, the people whose lives were put on display, often sensationalized or just outright exploited for the sake of profit. And honestly, it is the life of the performers who should be getting way more attention than they do. Their stories are the ones filled with resilience and tragedy and incredible humanity, despite what's been done to them. So why do we spend so much time talking about someone like Barnum instead? Well, because he was the one who made the fortune, right? He was the one who controlled the narrative. Barnum wasn't just a showman, he was a genius at marketing, at making sure his name would outshine everyone else's. Even today, when we talk about freak shows, Barnum is the first name that comes up, even though he didn't invent the concept. But here's the thing. Without the performers, there wouldn't be a story to tell. Barnum's fate and fortune were built on their lives, on their differences and challenges, and in some cases, their pain. And yet their stories are often reduced to footnotes, while Barnum's showmanship takes center stage. So as we move forward in this episode, we're going to do our best to shift the spotlight where it really belongs, on the performers themselves. Because while Barnum may have called it the greatest show on earth, it was definitely the people on stage who made it great.
In our last episodes, we've already told you a little bit about some of the stars of the shows like Joyce Heth or General Tom Thumb and even Jumbo the elephant. But there's so many more stories to tell. And I say let's start with Chang and Eng Bunker, the original Siamese twins. Chang and Eng were born on 11th of May 1811 in a small fishing village in Samut Songkhram, Siam, which is modern-day Thailand. Their parents, Nok, a fisherman, and Ti, a homemaker, were of Chinese descent. Although it's a little bit of a mystery if their mother was Chinese or Malay or a mix of both.
I think you also pronounce Siam differently than we do. How do you say Siam?
Oh, we say Siam.
We say Siam, I think. Yeah. Gotcha.
I think they were the middle children of a total of 9 children, so there were 7 siblings. And apparently Ti said that the birth of Chang and Eng, was way harder than the birth of all the other children.
Yeah, I bet it was. I'm amazed it didn't kill her, to be honest, you know?
Yeah, because they were conjoined at the chest by a small band of cartilage, but that didn't stop Chang and Eng. They lived surprisingly active lives. They swam and they ran and they worked alongside their father, adapting to their physical condition with remarkable independence. Their parents made sure to raise them and basically treat them just like any of the other children. Their journey to international fame began in 1824 when Scottish merchant Robert Hunter first saw them swimming at dusk in the Menam River. At first, Hunter mistook them for quote-unquote a strange animal. But upon meeting them, he immediately saw an opportunity to make money. And for 5 years, Hunter negotiated with the Siamese government to bring the twins to the West. He later claimed that the Siamese king had initially ordered the twins' death and refused to allow them to leave the country, but whether or not this story is true remains very unclear. I think it might have been something to be more, another instance of sensationalizing a story or inventing things to make the audience go, ooh.
Yes, agreed.
In 1829, Hunter finally left Siam with the twins, and the contract Hunter signed with Chang and Eng stipulated that the tour would last for 5 years. Though rumors later circulated that the twins' mother had actually sold them into slavery, basically. This claim really deeply upset Chang and Eng, obviously, who kept on denying that this was not true, that they were not sold by their parents or their mother. Yeah, by their mother, because I think their father had passed away by that time already.
Right.
Quite on the contrary, the mother apparently had no idea what really happened to her sons, just that they had left the country with a foreigner. And it was only years later, in 1845, that Christian missionaries found Ti and told her about Chang and Eng. And she actually hadn't seen her sons in 15 years and was convinced at the time that they had died. And she learned not only that they were alive, but also that they had married and settled in America. She died in 1849 without reuniting with her sons. It's so hard for us, I think, to really grasp how out of touch you would be with your family if you leave the country.
Yep. I think even, millennials today can't comprehend it. Like, we at least have memories. I have memories of being pretty much only able to correspond by letter with people because long distance phone calls were too expensive. Whereas today's kids don't even have that.
When I was living in Mexico, the internet obviously was already a thing, but most people didn't have internet at home, so I always had to go to the internet cafe to send emails to my family because, we had ICQ, but my family didn't use that. And we could send SMS messages via phone.
That's right.
It cost so much money, but it was absolutely groundbreaking that you could send a message and got an immediate reply from another continent. Yeah.
Yep.
But back to Chang and Eng arriving in the USA. So they stepped off the ship in Boston, where they were exhibited as living curiosities. Audiences were absolutely captivated by their conjoined bodies and their exotic origins. They performed athletic feats, they engaged in conversations to demonstrate their intelligence, and soon they became national and international celebrities. It was during this time that the term Siamese twins was coined. The phrase is rather outdated and insensitive today, at least in English, because here's a fact for you, it's still the most commonly used term for conjoined twins in German, Siamesische Zwillinge. Even in some medical publications I found up to this day, there is, however, some effort made to replace the term in German as well. But yeah, if you ever in your lifetime heard or used the term Siamese twins, that term goes back to the Bunker twins.
That's right. Yeah. I'm just thinking about that change, because I feel like growing up it was Siamese twins and it's just recently that we say conjoined instead, which is, it's just interesting, isn't it? How for decades, even centuries sometimes, we can use a term without even knowing where these terms come from. It's also interesting, and this could be a whole other episode that we did, although it would be a tough one. One thing our listeners might not be aware of, or maybe, is words and phrases that are considered PC, like the correct current term to use here, would be very racist in Austria and vice versa. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And there's so many things, there's so many examples of that.
If you're conversing online with a person, you should always consider the cultural background might differ from your own and not be immediately
That's right.
lecturing other people.
Jumping down people's throat. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of times we never really knew where these terms come from, like jumbo. Speaking of jumbo, just this weekend, a little while ago, if anyone is interested in these kind of stories, and I feel some of them will be, there was a real tragedy at Tufts University. One of their athletic teams, someone died. Maybe two people I can't remember, but a student died during an athletic practice, and they were trying to figure out what had happened and how to prevent it from happening again. And it was on the news just over this past weekend. And I was looking at the field and I paused it and took a picture because I had no idea. It's the Jumbos, Tufts University, where Jumbo the elephant was housed. Their mascot, their university mascot are the Jumbos, the elephant. So this just happened. I was so excited. Anyway.
So back to Chang and Eng. So after a few years, they had grown more and more frustrated with their managers and the financial exploitation they had to face or endure. And they could actually take control of their own careers, managing their own tours and ultimately keeping most of the profits. And this independence was very rare for performers of the era and made them really wealthy. They made truly a fortune. In 1839, they settled in Mount Airy, North Carolina, becoming naturalized U.S. citizens and adopting the surname Bunker. In 1843, they married the sisters Adelaide and Sarah Yates in a double wedding. This caused a scandal at the time, but for them, their unconventional arrangement seemed to work. This excerpt is from an article from the Alexandria Gazette from Alexandria, Virginia. It's from Thursday, 27th of April, 1843, and it was on page 2. Quote, "Marriage extraordinary. There are few of our readers in this city or in any of the principal towns in the country who have not seen the famous United Brothers, the Siamese twins. They have been residing for several years past in North Carolina, where they purchased a plantation. We had not heard of them for a long time when we received a letter yesterday from a correspondent in North Carolina informing us that they had entered into a state of double blessedness. Our correspondent says, quote, on Thursday, April 13th, were married at Wilkes County, North Carolina by Elder Colby Sparks of the Baptist Church, Mrs. Chang and Eng, the Siamese twin brothers, to Mrs. Sarah and Adelaide, daughters of Mr. David Yeats of Wilkes County, North Carolina, end quote. Whether the happy quadruple started on a journey to pass off the honeymoon or remained at home, we are not informed, end quote. Together, the four of them had 21 children. Chang fathered 10 and Eng fathered 11. They alternated 3-day stays between their two homes, balancing family life and work. Now I'm wondering, did they do like 3 days, and then took a day off, or?
No, I think they just did 3 days, 3 days, 3 days, 3 days, back and forth, because then it would alter who got weekends and stuff.
Oh, that's true. That's smart, yeah.
Yeah, that's my guess. I think it's pretty extraordinary. It makes me happy that these men were born with really everything stacked against them, but managed to live a very normal, quote unquote, life, in terms of love, marriage, and children. I feel like their parents, even though their mother never saw them again, I feel like they would have been over the moon for everything that they achieved, because it's kind of incredible, isn't it? It's also worth noting, I think, if you don't know Chang and Eng today, I think theirs would be, it seems like theirs would be a very straightforward removal.
Yeah, I think so.
They look like two complete people with a tiny bit of attachment in the chest area, like there's a little tube connecting them almost. Obviously, back then, there's no way you would attempt anything like that. But today, I think they would have been successfully separated very easily at birth.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the short article about the wedding, they mentioned the fact that the Bunker twins had purchased a plantation in North Carolina. And as I told you before, after years of successful independent touring, Chang and Eng had accumulated substantial wealth, which was definitely also extraordinary for the Asian performers of the era. I think that comes on top of everything. And they decided to invest their money in real estate. So on 1st of March 1845, they purchased 650 acres of land along Stewart's Creek, about 5 miles south of Mount Airy. And this marked a shift in their lives from public performers to plantation owners. However, and we also need to talk about this chapter of their lives is not without controversy, because like many prosperous landowners in the antebellum South, Chang and Eng purchased enslaved people to work their farm. By 1850, records show they owned 18 enslaved individuals, half of whom were children under the age of 7. And some of these children were raised to work the fields, while others were intended for sale later on for a profit. As the years passed, the number of enslaved people they owned grew, and by the beginning of the Civil War, their holdings had expanded to at least 28 individuals, ranging again from small children to 40-year-old field hands. Some sources suggest that at their peak, the Bunkers owned up to 30 people. At the time, their net worth was estimated at nearly $30,000, which was a fortune in the mid-19th century. We also have documentation of some of these transactions. For example, on 29th of September 1845, Chang and Eng purchased 2 enslaved girls, Mary, who was aged 7.5, and Nicey, who was aged 5.5, from a man named Thomas F. Breather for $450. The bill of sale, which was registered in Surrey County Court in early 1846, guaranteed that the girls were, quote, sound and healthy, unquote. Another record from 1855 lists 10 enslaved individuals of varying ages, including Bernie, who was a man in his 60s, and Caroline, a 6-year-old girl. These documents also show how Chang and Eng divided their property. Eng, for example, sold his share of these individuals to Chang for a nominal fee of just $1, transferring full ownership to Chang. And while the exact reasons for these transactions are unclear, I think it shows how their lives were really intertwined. They had shared assets, even when these shared assets were also people. The Bunkers' decision to participate in slavery, many people might find it contradictory. These were men who had been objectified, exploited, and treated as commodities during their years as performers, and yet, when given the chance to secure their wealth and social status in the American South, they choose to perpetuate a system that did the same to others. And I think this story forces us a little bit to confront a very uncomfortable truth. Individuals who are victims of one form of exploitation can still become complicit in other forms of exploitation, or even the same form of exploitation. It's also worth noting that slavery was, of course, deeply embedded in the Southern economy, and that the twins' choice to own enslaved people aligned, I think, with their efforts to solidify their social standing in their adopted home. I don't want to excuse their actions, but I think it's also important, like always, to provide historical context for understanding what's going on and what happened.
Yeah.
Also, you might be wondering if slavery had existed in Siam, because that was my first thought, that maybe they were just used to a system that knew slavery. Yes, slavery existed in Siam. However, slavery in Siam was very different from what they encountered in the United States. Slavery in Siam often took the form of debt bondage, like indentured servitude. These things, people sold themselves or their children into servitude to pay off their debts. But enslaved individuals in Siam had rights, and many could eventually earn their freedom. It was a system that was tied to hierarchy, but wasn't based on race.
Right. And you weren't actually owned by someone. Like indentured servitude is different from slavery. Both bad, but there's a difference.
You couldn't be just sold off, for example.
That's right. You were no one else's property. You belonged to you.
That context raises an important question. I think, did their familiarity with Siamese slavery influence their decision to own enslaved people later in America, or was it purely a matter of economic survival and assimilation into the culture of the antebellum South?
It's really impossible to know. Because of how I am as a person, I'd like to think that Eng sold his share of enslaved people because he felt bad about owning people, right? But we have no idea. We just have no idea. And when you look through history, these kind of contradictions aren't new, are they? People can ultimately be very self-serving. So I don't want to go on the side of like, oh, they were just looking out for number one and they didn't care. And I also don't want to say, oh, they cared deeply, but whatever, because we just don't know. Probably somewhere between those two things, right?
That's the thing. There's always, everything is always way more complex than we would like it to be.
Mm-hmm.
That also makes it interesting, I think, and important also to learn from the past for future. I have to say that over the years, the Bunker twins had not just sat on their plantation, they had now and then returned to touring for a little bit, often with some of their children. In 1860, Chang and Eng Bunker found themselves in a very tough financial spot. the looming tensions of the Civil War were already affecting the Southern economy, and with a growing number of children to support, the twins decided to return to performing more regularly. And this time, they briefly teamed up with the one and only P.T. Barnum. The twins signed a 1-month contract with Barnum to perform at his American Museum in New York City. For Chang and Eng, this was the perfect place and opportunity to reignite their fame while benefiting from Barnum's promotional prowess. During their stint, the twins were showcased as one of the museum's major attractions, and after the month-long engagement, the twins moved on as they had always preferred controlling their own careers. As the Civil War ended in 1865, Chang and Eng found themselves facing serious financial difficulties. Like many in the South, they had lent money that was repaid in worthless Confederate currency, and their enslaved workers were now emancipated. To support their families, they decided to resume touring. But there was a slight problem. Audiences in the North weren't as welcoming as they had been before. The twins were now seen as former Confederate slaveholders, and newspapers mocked them for losing, quote, a considerable number of slaves of about the same color as themselves, end quote.
Oh, God, that's so racist.
Oh. To counteract this perception, Chang and Eng presented themselves sympathetically as aging fathers with their large families. Why do I sound like Laszlo today? Families. New York City.
New York City.
They emphasized their reluctant support for their state over the country and shared that both had sons who suffered during the war, one injured and one captured while serving in the Confederate Army. This really didn't sway the public's opinion as much as they had hoped, and so they started to find their luck touring overseas. In 1870, for example, they toured Germany and Russia, but they were forced to cut their trip short due to the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War. On the ship home, Chang suffered a stroke that paralyzed his right side, and from that point on his health steadily declined, and he relied heavily on Eng, who cared for him with unwavering dedication. By 1874, Chang's health had worsened and he developed bronchitis, and despite his doctor's advice to stay warm and indoors and stay in bed, the brothers traveled through freezing weather to Eng's house to see Eng's family. And on the night of 16th of January, Chang struggled to breathe and insisted they sleep sitting up in front of the fireplace. Exhausted from caring for his brother, Eng eventually moved them both to bed.
So he can just pick him up, I guess. Yeah.
I guess, yeah. The next morning, one of Eng's sons discovered that Chang had died in his sleep. And when Eng realized that his brother had passed away, he reportedly said, quote, "Then I'm going," end quote. And wouldn't you know it, within 2 hours, Eng also passed away. And while Chang's death was attributed to a cerebral blood clot, the exact cause of Eng's death remains a mystery. Some doctors suggest that it was shock or grief, while others theorized that Eng's circulatory system failed as blood drained into his deceased brother's body.
Oh, yeah, that's a possibility.
At the time of their death, the twins were 62 years old, making them the longest living conjoined twins in history until 2012, which I didn't know. I had no idea.
Wow. Yeah.
The autopsy was conducted by Dr. William Pancoast at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, and though rumors suggest that their widows were pressured or even paid to donate their bodies, the procedure was framed as a quote-unquote duty to science. Their findings confirmed that their livers were fused, but most of their vital organs were separate. Modern medicine suggests they could have been successfully separated today, just like Annie said before.
Yeah. The Mutter Museum in Philadelphia has a death cast of the brothers. I haven't been there yet, but it is on my list to go. Yeah, so far in these episodes, we've talked about some of Barnum's most famous performers, like General Tom Thumb, and now Chang and Eng Bunker, who managed to use their fame to gain wealth, independence, and even a degree of control over their lives. But not everyone in the world of the freak show was so lucky. For every performer who thrived, there were countless others who were exploited and treated as little more than commodities. Their stories defined not by their talents or their humanity, but by the greed of those who controlled them. One of the most tragic examples of this is Julia Pastrana. While she had no association with Barnum, her story is still important to tell, as her life represents the very dark, very exploitative side of freak show culture. Her story is heartbreaking, both for what she endured during her life and for what happened after her death. And unlike some of the stars we've talked about, Julia's voice was almost entirely stolen from her. Before she became known to the world as the Ape Woman or the Bear Woman, Julia Pastrana was just a young girl growing up in Mexico in the early 19th century. Her story begins around 1834, although records of her exact birthplace are unclear. Some accounts suggest she was born in the mountains of Sinaloa in a small indigenous community. From birth, Julia exhibited signs of hypertrichosis terminalis, a rare condition that causes excessive hair growth all over the body. Her face and body were covered with thick, dark hair, and she also suffered from gingival hyperplasia, which thickened her gums and gave her lips a protruding appearance. These conditions set her apart from others, and as you can imagine, shaped her life in profound and tragic ways. Julia's early years are somewhat unclear, as the people who promoted and exploited her pretty much made up the craziest stories they could think of in order to draw in the crowd. So here are some of the things that were said about Julia, but please, as we say, take it with a grain of arsenic because who can say? Her mother, seeing Julia's thick covering of dark hair and her unusual facial features, feared that her daughter's appearance was the result of supernatural interference. In the region's indigenous communities, physical differences were often attributed to the Nahualli, shape-shifting werewolves believed to bring misfortune. Julia's mother, overcome with fear and stigma, is said to have whispered their name when she saw her daughter for the first time. Depending on the account, Julia's mother either fled their tribe in shame or was cast out after her birth. For 2 years, Julia and her mother reportedly lived in a mountain cave, surviving in hiding. It wasn't until a group of Mexican herders, searching for a missing cow, stumbled upon them that Julia's life changed course. They brought the pair to the nearest city, where Julia was placed in an orphanage. Even as a small child, Julia's sweet disposition, intelligence, and distinctive appearance made her a local celebrity. People from nearby towns would come to see the hair-covered girl, whose charm and wit quickly endeared her to everyone she met. News of Julia eventually reached the governor of Sinaloa, who adopted her into his household when she was still a child. Where's her mom? Was it just like, oh, we found these 2 people and then she's just gone, kind of? I feel kind of bad for the mom. It's like they found the 2 of them and then she's kind of
I think that's
gone.
all just bullshit stories they made
Rumors.
up. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
In the governor's home, Julia worked as a maid, but was also treated as a form of live-in amusement. Guests were often brought in to marvel at her, reinforcing the idea that her body was something to be displayed and examined. Despite this, Julia's time in the governor's house gave her access to opportunities that were rare for a young indigenous woman in 19th century Mexico. She learned to read and write, as well as how to sing and dance, skills that would shape her future career. At one point, Julia left the governor's household. Now again, there exists a few different stories. Was she bought by a customs official from Mazatlan, or did she leave voluntarily and was then persuaded to come to the United States? We don't know for sure. So what we do know is that she ended up in December of 1854 in New York. That's the first time we find her name in an American newspaper. This is from the New York Times, Wednesday, December 20th, 1854, in the amusement section on page 8. You see these little snippets of things. So it says, quote, "The hybrid or semi-human Indian from Mexico. The Stuyvesant Institute, number 6-something Broadway. This is pronounced to be the most popular exhibition in New York. Nearly 1,000 persons have visited her during the last 2 days and a half. La mujer osa is the lion of the day. Ladies are captivated with her affability and the patriotic Spanish chansons. The link between mankind and the orangutan is recognized by medical and scientific men. Dr. Mott's startling epistle to Mr. J.A. Boone confirming the duality of La Mujer Osa has created an indelible impression on the public. During the holidays, Julia will continue to hold her levees, admittance 25 cents. And then we see Thursday, December 28th, 1854, they write, and I apologize, some of this, it's one of those scanned papers that's a little bit hard to make out sometimes. And this one reads, quote, "The hybrid or semi-human Indian from Mexico. Christmas holidays cannot be more agreeably passed than in attending the levees of Julia Pastrana, whose dulcet voice enchants the ladies. Julieta Grisi is not more popular." That must be some
another singer, I guess.
Yeah. Dr. Mott's impressive epistle concerning the duality of La Mujer Osa astounds the public. The troglodyte of ancient days is recognized, quote, 4 feet in height, with eyes like the owl, and gifted with speech, the link between mankind and the orangutan, unquote. Admissions, 25 cents, end quote. So, yeah, these are just terrible. They're just terrible. So apparently, Julia initially worked under the management of a promoter named J.W. Beach. He helped organize her first appearances in the U.S. However, during one of her performances, Julia caught the attention of Theodore Lent, an opportunistic American showman and probably also a criminal with a sharp eye for profit.
He's the worst.
Yeah, he's not. This guy's bad.
He's not great, no.
Lent immediately saw the financial potential in Julia's unique appearance and talents. But if you search for the name Theodore Lent in old newspapers from like 1830 to 1850, you're going to find several short notes about him being involved in criminal activity. For example, New York Daily Herald, Tuesday, March 15th, 1853, page 4. Quote, "In the matter of false pretenses against Theodore Lent, the case of Theodore Lent, charged with obtaining several $100s from a female named Breda, keeper of a house of ill fame at number 74 Mercer Street, was concluded yesterday before Justice Stewart. The magistrate gave his decision by holding Mr. Lent to bail in the sum of $1,000 to answer the charge at court." Or New York Daily Herald, Thursday, December 14th, 1848, page 2. Quote, "Charge of forgery and false pretenses. Officer Stevens of the lower police arrested yesterday a young man by the name of Theodore Lent on a warrant issued by Justice McGrath, wherein he stands charged with perjury, forgery, and false pretenses," end quote. So he was involved in prostitution. He wasn't a good guy. He was not the most trustworthy character at all. And I feel confident to say by the end of this, everyone's going to hate him as much as we do. Okay. Yeah. So he wasn't born into show business, but his life orbited around opportunity. His family ran a stage and omnibus company.
That was funny. When I read that, I was like, his family ran a stage business. And I thought stage like theater stage. And I'm like, well, he was kind of into show business then. Until I realized, no, it's
stage coaches. Yeah, an omnibus. So he lived and worked in Lower Manhattan, and he had dabbled in several trades before he crossed paths with Julia. In the early 1850s, Lent worked as a furniture salesman, a plumber, and an auctioneer, hardly a resume for managing performers. But directories from the time place him at 495 Broadway, just a few blocks from venues where Julia performed in New York City. Was it chance, coincidence, or calculated interest? Regardless of how they first met, Lent recognized Julia's potential immediately. Pretty soon, immediately after they first met, Lent was traveling with Julia as part of her performing group. Some accounts suggest he and his brother Samuel worked behind the scenes for her promoters, assisting with logistics, or even posing as performers themselves. Others speculate that the Lent brothers may have helped transport Julia's party from city to city. But whatever the role, Theodore's ultimate goal became clear when he married Julia in Baltimore that same year, conveniently securing both her career and her earnings under his control, as he quickly positioned himself as both her manager and husband. We can only speculate here, but from everything we know, it really looks as if this marriage was nothing about love and more to do with Lent solidifying his control over her.
The sad thing is that I read that Julia said about her husband that he's the only person who loves her for who she is, which is sad.
That makes me incredibly sad. Yeah. Wow. Her decision to marry Lent to us, seems very difficult to understand, although knowing what you just said, it feels like...
I think she felt loved, yeah.
She felt loved. And that's not different. I mean, women and men end up in terrible relationships all the time because they felt loved. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he was very manipulative, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we knew also, though, that Julia's intelligence and charm really did shine through in her performances. She would have been more than capable of engaging with audiences and managing herself, really, but Lent kept tight control on his wife for
I think he
her whole life.
she was only allowed to leave the house if she was even allowed completely veiled so that nobody could see her face for free.
That's right, you had to pay. After her marriage to Theodore Lent in 1854, Julia Pastrana's life, it just became a never-ending cycle of performance, examinations, and exploitation. If she had any hope that this marriage was going to bring her stability, she was mistaken. Her husband saw her as a business venture and not as a wife, and he took total control over her life and career. She began touring extensively across the United States. Her new husband was relentless in marketing Julia as a spectacle. She was billed under grotesque and humiliating names, such as the before-mentioned Ape Woman, the Baboon Lady, and the Bear Woman. Posters described her as a human-animal hybrid, a so-called missing link between humans and primates, feeding into the 19th century obsession with Darwinism and racial pseudoscience. The idea that Julia was not fully human was reinforced by actual doctors. During her life, Julia had been subjected to numerous medical examinations that often dehumanized her. One notable instance involved Dr. Alexander B. Mott.
The one they mentioned before, I think, in the articles, right?
That's right. Yep. He was a prominent New York physician and son of renowned surgeon Valentine Mott. After a private examination, Dr. Mott proclaimed that Julia was a hybrid resulting from the union of a human and orangutan. And that is how Lent started to promote her. In many newspapers, we found announcements like, quote, the hybrid or semi-human Indian from Mexico would be performing here or there. And in the Louisville Evening Bulletin, Wednesday, May 16, 1885, on page 3, we find, quote, a bear woman. Some time ago, we read in the St. Louis Democrat a description of a bear woman which had been brought from Mexico to be exhibited. She was sent to New York, where she was exhibited. At present, she is on exhibition at Chicago. The editor of the Tribune has seen her and gives the following description of her. She is represented as belonging to a tribe of beings called the Opates, which inhabit the Sierra Madre Mountains in the state of Sinaloa, adjoining California, in Mexico. They live in a naked state in caves and subsist on roots, insects, barks of trees, etc. Their features bear so close a resemblance to those of a bear and orangutan that many believe them to be real hybrids, which opinion is sustained by the written testimony of the celebrated anatomists and surgeons Dr. A. B. Mott of New York and Dr. Warren Stone of New Orleans. The former pronounces her a, quote, hybrid wherein the nature of woman predominates over the brute, end quote, but doctors will disagree, and it is probable some anatomist may be found in the city who will dissent from the above dictum of the eminent New Yorker. We found the creature, Julia Pastrana, to be about 4 foot 6 inches in height, with arms, hands, and feet well formed. Her mouth is elongated, with very thick double lips, having no upper teeth in front. Her face is covered with a thick, coarse black beard, giving it very much the appearance of that of a bear. Her disposition is mild and affable, and she has considerable intellect. She converses fluently and intelligently in Spanish, and has some knowledge of English. She has learnt some of the lighter female accomplishments, and has progressed so far as to be able to do any kind of sewing, and to attend the arrangements of her room. We were surprised to hear her sing a very pretty little Spanish song. Altogether, she is a curiosity that's worth one's while to go and see." End quote. And then there's a drawing of her. We'll share that.
There are a lot.
That's right. Yeah. Lent's strategy, much like Barnum's, was sensationalism. He encouraged audiences to debate Julia's humanity and invited more scientists to examine her publicly. Physicians, anatomists, and journalists wrote about her in medical journals, often using dehumanizing language to describe her as a biological anomaly rather than a woman with thoughts and feelings. And I think that's what has to be done, right? It has to be presented as a look at this absolute animal who occasionally seems human, because to do otherwise is abhorrent, isn't it?
Look, I can understand that the scientists and doctors were interested in her.
Of course.
But
oh, yeah. It's just bad. And, the article is an example of that. What the people didn't expect was Julia's intelligence and her talent, right? Unlike some other quote-unquote human curiosities who were silent exhibits, Julia sang, danced, and spoke several languages. She was charming and witty and had a natural ability to win those over who had come to gawk at her. Some audience members entered the theater expecting to see a monster and left totally captivated by a woman who was far more than her appearance. Her fame quickly spread beyond the U.S., and by the late 1850s, Lent took her to Europe, where she toured in London, Germany, and Russia. European newspapers took a keen interest in her, with some journalists writing about her with sympathy and others fueling the spectacle with racist and pseudoscientific theories. Okay, so it's 1857. Julia is in London, and her performances are drawing huge crowds, including, as we said before, many scientists and doctors legitimately eager to meet and examine her and find out what was going on here. But there's one famous scientist who did not go see Julia perform, and that was Charles Darwin. I think we definitely talked about him, right? When we covered the Galapagos affair, I think.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, because of the finches, right?
Yeah,
the Darwin
that's right.
finches.
Yep. And so when you hear the name of Charles Darwin, you just think of one thing, don't you? Beagles. But for most people, it's evolution, right? Is what you expect. So Darwin is, of course, the scientist who changed how we understood life itself, arguing that all species, including humans, evolved over time through natural selection. Throughout the 1850s, Darwin was in England, living at Down House in Kent, where he was deeply immersed in research. This was the decade when he finally developed his groundbreaking theory of evolution by natural selection. He had spent years gathering evidence from his voyage on the HMS Beagle, studying specimens, and corresponding with scientists worldwide. Darwin was aware of Julia's case, but he, as I said, never saw her in person. But that didn't stop him from having an opinion of her and writing about her. He referenced her in his work, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, describing her as having, quote, an irregular double set of teeth that contributed to her gorilla-like appearance, end quote. But of course, this was all based on second-hand reports, not his own observations.
How very scientific of him.
I was just going to say, come on, Darwin, do better. This is upsetting. This is okay. One of the most upsetting and humiliating experiences for Julia occurred in Moscow, where Lent forced her to undergo a public medical examination by Russian scientists. Physicians were allowed to touch her, measure her skull, poke and prod at her body, all while she was very much awake and alive and letting this happen. She had to. Other doctors declared her to be a separate species. Some wrote about her as though she were a medical curiosity rather than a person. And of course, the audiences all over Europe, just like the American audience, gawked at her. Huge crowds wanted to see her, and Lent was raking in money.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, Barnum actually did try to win her over to work for him at one point. But this is one of the rare times he lost because Lent was, of course, not willing to give up control over his wife and his moneymaker.
But of course, Julia had no access to her own earnings. Everything she made went directly to her husband. By 1859, Julia Pastrana was still touring Europe under the control of Theodore Lent, performing for massive crowds in Germany and Russia. But something else was happening. Julia was pregnant. Despite the exhausting nature of her performances and constant travel, she continued to work right up until she gave birth in Moscow in 1860. On March 20, 1860, Julia delivered a baby boy who was born with the same condition as his mother. His tiny body was covered in hair, and he had the distinctive facial features caused by hypertrichosis and gingival hyperplasia. But the world would never get to know him. He lived for only 3 days before passing away. Julia, weak from childbirth and suffering from complications, died 5 days later on March 25, 1860, from postpartum complications. She was only 26 years old. Unfortunately, her tragic story does not end there. Most people would grieve and bury their loved ones. Not Theodore Lent. Absolute human leech in a second-hand waistcoat. Terrible. Terrible. Instead of mourning, Lent saw another business opportunity. He had Julia's body embalmed, along with their deceased baby boy, and continued exhibiting them across Europe. Even in death, Julia was denied dignity. Her mummified remains were displayed in a glass case, drawing crowds who had once watched her sing and dance, and now paid to gawk at her lifeless form. Lent profited even more from Julia in death than he had during her lifetime. For years, he carted her body from country to country, showing her off like a museum artifact. And when the public's interest started to wane, he married another bearded woman, Marie Bartel, and presented her as Julia's sister, keeping his grotesque exploitation alive. Same routine, same exploitation, but a new victim. Lent had one business model, and it was profiting off of women that he saw as curiosities. However, karma finally cashed in. Lent, after years of growing more erratic, went insane. He was institutionalized in a mental asylum in St. Petersburg, Russia, where he spent the rest of his life babbling nonsense until he died. The exact year he died is unclear, but one thing is certain, no one missed him. But even then, Julia still wasn't free. Lent's widow, Maria Bartel, known under her stage name Julia Pastrana, sold the embalmed bodies of Julia and her son and returned to Germany. The bodies went through so many owners, it's hard to even follow her way through Europe. Julia was displayed in Vienna and Hamburg and so many other cities and countries. In 1921, Julia's mummified remains were purchased by Håkon Lund, the manager of Norway's largest carnival, from an American dealer in Berlin. She arrived as part of a cabinet of curiosities filled with 8,000 other objects, including preserved body parts, deformed fetuses, Siamese twin embryos, and even an entire human skin nailed to a plank. It's really the kind of collection that makes you ask, who are these people? And I mean these people, like 8,000 body parts, embryos, conjoined twin, like, no. Lund exhibited Julia and her infant son in what he called the Hygienic and Anatomical Exhibition alongside his Wax Museum of Venereal Disease, because apparently people in the 1920s just loved a horrifying night out. His slogan was "Humanity, know thyself."
I think he meant it in a more ominous and
yeah.
Like, it's not know thyself. For me, if I read it, it sounds like in my head, know thyself.
Yes. Do you watch Severance?
Yeah.
It sounds like something that you would walk into an office and this would be the whole situation there.
Yeah.
It's very... and do you think that... Okay, it's the 1920s and you're planning your date night out, right? And are you going to do the Venereal Disease Wax Museum before or after dinner? How do you parse that, do you think?
We had the anatomical museum in Vienna. When I was in school, we made a tour there, and there were body parts of people who were injured or even died in horrible accidents with electricity. And it was their embalmed body parts. It was horrible.
Part of it sounds interesting to me too, though.
It was interesting, but also, like, is that the right thing for, like, I think we were 15 at the time?
Yeah, no, probably not. Probably not. I had the uncomfortable realization when I was reading about this. I thought, I'd be more likely to go and see a mummy than I would be to go and gawk at a human, like a living person. Does that make sense? Like, if I was that person back in the day, if it was, 200 years ago or whatever, I think I would rather... I just can't wrap my head around it, honestly. I feel like all of us are probably just,
I think we probably... If we would have lived 200 years ago, we all probably would have gone and looked at these people.
Totally.
Like, we would have
100%.
Went and watched executions, and I don't know, because it's horrible, but if something is normalized at a time, I think you just don't think about how horrible that is.
I think it's also important to mention, though, also, like, as someone who does want to visit some place like the Mutter Museum or different, I think it's important to point out that not, like, when I see these things, when I've seen bodies on display in museums before, which is its own very controversial topic. But when I look at them, it's personally with respect. I realize that I'm looking at a person and I'm thinking of them as a person the whole time that I'm very interestedly looking at whatever details are of interest. Does that make sense? I don't think everyone who wanted to see was a ha-ha, look at this gross, disgusting thing. I think a lot of people are like us, where it's like, this is, what's the word? Curiosity, not judgment, right? Like, I want to know more about all of this.
It's just such a gray area, and where do we draw the line?
It's so, we could do a whole podcast on that, but yeah. I still can't get over the Venereal Disease Wax Museum, though. I have so many questions. But times were changing. So by the 20th century, freak show culture was dying out and people weren't as eager to gawk at human remains. Lund tried to adapt, rebranding his show as educational, hiring medical students in white lab coats to act as guides, and slapping up posters with scientific-sounding explanations. And then came World War II. When the Nazis occupied Norway, they deemed the entire exhibit obscene and ordered the wax figures to be melted down for candle wax, which is both horrifying and ironic considering the actual atrocities they were committing, right? Like, you look at the things that were actually being done, and it's like, a wax museum of venereal disease? Absolutely not. Okay. Somehow, Lund managed to hide Julia's body and keep it intact, but after the war, her remains were placed in storage and largely forgotten. By the 1970s, human exhibitions were completely out of fashion, and when Lund attempted to tour with Julia again, newspapers erupted in outrage. In 1973, Sweden banned the display of corpses for profit, effectively ending Julia's time as an exhibit. With nowhere left to showcase her, Lund shoved the mummies into storage near Oslo and abandoned them. Then, in 1976, a group of teenagers broke into the storage facility. Thinking Julia was a mannequin, They ripped off her arm. Her infant son's fragile body was completely destroyed and thrown away. The police eventually recovered what was left of Julia, but at this point her body had been disrespected beyond belief. For years, she was shuffled from one storage facility to another, lingering in bureaucratic limbo. In 1990, Norwegian journalists rediscovered her remains in the basement of Oslo's Institute of Forensic Medicine, sparking a national debate. Should she be buried? Should she be studied? Should she be put back on display? For nearly 2 more decades, committees, politicians, and scientists argued over her fate. Some insisted that she should remain in an anatomical collection for future medical research. Others pushed for her to be finally laid to rest. Then, in 2005, a Mexican artist named Laura Anderson Barbata began a relentless campaign to bring Julia home. I guess her name is probably Laura, right? Not Laura. She placed a death notice for Julia in a Norwegian newspaper and even arranged for a Catholic mass in her honor. By 2008, her efforts paid off. Norwegian authorities finally agreed that Julia had no business being kept in a storage facility against her will. In 2013, so 153 years after her death, Julia Pastrana was finally returned home to Mexico. Her white coffin, covered in white roses, was buried in Sinaloa de Leyva, near her birthplace. It took more than a century, but Julia was finally honored as a woman and not a monster. During her lifetime, there were a handful of people who saw Julia for what she was, an intelligent, kind, heartfelt young woman. But Julia Pastrana's story fascinated people for decades after her death. Writers, journalists, and historians all tried to piece together who she really was, some getting it right, others not so much. One of the men who wrote about her was Hermann Waldemar Otto, a German author born in 1861, which, if you're paying attention, is 1 year after Julia died. And yet, in some sources, you'll find the claims that Otto met Julia in person as if they'd crossed paths during her lifetime, which is, of course, impossible. Otto wasn't just a writer. He had been a circus performer himself. He worked as an equestrian in traveling circuses, meaning he had firsthand experience in the world of entertainers, sideshow, and freak exhibitions. Later, he became a historian of the performing arts. Under his pen name, Signor Saltarino, really? He documented the lives of circus acts, human curiosities, acrobats, and anyone who made a living on the fringes of entertainment. But by the time he was writing about Julia, she had been dead for decades. So no, Hermann Waldemar Otto never met Julia Pastrana. Everything he wrote about her came from secondhand sources, people who had seen her perform, examined her, or more disturbingly, from the time her embalmed body was still being displayed around Europe. And yet, even though he never saw her in life, he might have still seen her for who she was. Unlike many others who wrote about Julia as a medical specimen or a curiosity, Otto understood that she was more than the freak show posters made her out to be. He wrote, quote, "A monster to the whole world, an abnormality put on display for money, someone who had been taught a few artistic turns like a trained animal. But for the few who knew her better, she was a warm, feeling, thoughtful, spiritually very gifted being with a sensitive heart and mind, and it affected her very deeply in her heart with sadness, having to stand beside people instead of with them, and to be shown as a freak for money, not sharing any of the everyday joys in a home filled with love." End quote. It's so sad.
Also, we have a huge problem now, because there are still a couple of more stories we would love to tell you. So we will tell you a little bit more next week, but we promise after that we're over and done with Victorian circuses for now.
Is that a promise we can make? I mean, for now.
For now. Let's say for now.
Yeah, for this year.
It's always the same when we get into one of these topics. We often think, yeah, that will be a nice episode or 2 or 3. And then while you're at it, you realize that you just spent 3 episodes talking about in my opinion, fascinating men, but now you also want to talk about the people whose stories really matter in all of this.
Oh, yeah. We have to talk about the victims. Oh, we have something good still, don't we?
My something good this week, my husband gave me an early birthday present. People in the Facebook group and on Instagram already saw it. It's a bird feeder with a camera. And now so many birds already are eating at my little bird feeder, and I've watched the videos the whole day. Like I get a pop-up message like, there's some movement detected at the bird feeder.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, they're so cute. And yesterday, the first time I had a robin, and he came back today. He or she, I'm not sure.
Your robins are so much cuter than our robins. We've said this many times before. I still love American robins, but our American robins look like they're going to cut you. And European robins are like sweet little fluffy balls of joy. Such a difference.
Also, this is going to sound really weird when I say it, but also our tits are really cute.
Oh, you have the best tits. Europe really does have all the best tits. Yeah. We only have the tufted titmouse. That's the only tit that we get, I think, in the United States. But yeah, I love the blue tit. Whenever I'm in England and I see a blue tit, it's very exciting. So cute.
Do you have something good?
My something good, this is a silly something good kind of, but I just ordered, so we've been doing Cinema Macabre for Patreon, where we've just started it and we're talking about candy on Hulu, and I'm trying to now, because we're doing video, trying to work out like my setup. So I just got a new like phone/iPad stand thingy, and Paul is trying to help me like really get this set up so that we're good for video too. And that's turning out to be kind of fun. I'm trying to have some fun with it. Like the space I'm in, it's our tiny little office, and then across the back wall, I put up a tension rod with curtains with as much fabric as I could to try to cut down the echoiness of the space. So I'm trying to create a cuter space, basically. And I'm kind of looking forward to setting up a cute little background space in our office for these videos, which sounds silly, but I like doing that kind of stuff.
I completely get it. And I think it's so much fun doing the videos. Like, seriously, I enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, the first one, I was way too close to the camera. That was devastating.
No, I think I was too far away and my sound wasn't good. But the second one is already really better, in my opinion. So
it is better.
We've been doing this thing for years now, this podcast, but it's just audio, usually.
Yep.
And we're learning. But it's fun.
We're learning. It is. Oh, the dogs found me. They're trying to get in. Literally.
All right.
They're trying to get in. Can you hear that? He's begging.
But Jamie's tiptoeing behind me because he wants his dinner. All right. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our other episodes, please do us a huge favor, huge favor. This really helps us out. Go to your podcast app and leave us a rating and or review. Check out our webpage, freshhellpodcast.com. There you find all the links to our merch store, to our Facebook group, to our Instagram, to what else? To our PO box, to our email, which is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. You also find the link to Patreon. I think that's it. Please tell your pets we said hi, hug them, cuddle them, treat them kindly, and be kind to your fellow human beings. And most importantly, be kind to yourself.
And just remember, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.